Welcome back, everybody. We're breaking down UFC 278, Usman versus Edwards 2, and we actually have a pretty stacked main card here, obviously headlined by Usman and Edwards. A very intriguing rematch between the two. It's been 7 years since they've fought, and I feel both have come a pretty long way since then. Usman obviously making his ascent much quicker, but both guys have been undefeated since their first fight. And then we have Costa versus Rockhold as the co-main. A very exciting fight there. Aldo versus Dvalishvili, another very compelling matchup. Tybura versus Romanov, another solid one. And then Pedro versus Hunsucker. Maybe not as great of a matchup. Definitely more along the lines of a squash match. But, I do expect a highlight reel knockout here. But the rest of the card is looking pretty solid as well. And we do have 13 fights here. So with that out of the way, let's dive right into the breakdowns. And kicking off the card, we have Victor Altamirano versus Daniel Da Silva. And Altamirano is the minus 190 favorite. Da Silva's the plus 165 underdog. And we'll start with Altamirano first. So with Altamirano, he is a very high output striker, good movement on the feet. He's able to switch stances in there. And with Altamirano, he's just constantly putting something out there. He can wrestle also. The cardio seems solid, and he is able to maintain a pretty strong pace for 3 rounds. But, the big knock on Altamirano is going to be his takedown defense. He is someone who can get taken down pretty easily, and he does kind of accept bottom position sometimes. He will work his way back up, but he sometimes can spend a little too much time, just throwing elbows and stuff off his back. And, generally that's just not a great look. The only time it really works is if his opponent's just laying on top and not throwing any sort of volume. But being on bottom, even if you are throwing volume, generally doesn't work out for the guy on bottom. And he's going up against Da Silva, who does appear to be a grappler. He's got a decent kicking game on the feet. But in both of his UFC fights, he did look to push the grappling pretty aggressively, pretty early. He's got a number of submission wins on the regionals also, but hasn't really had much success at the UFC level. Molina obviously was able to out-scramble him and eventually get the finish. But, even bad Figueiredo was able to pull off the knee bar against Da Silva. So not a particularly great look. But, I do still have some questions about the submission defense of Altamirano. One of his 2 pro losses are by submission, and he does have a number of amateur losses by submission. So, a little worrisome here. But I do still think that Altamirano is the side here. I just haven't really seen enough from Da Silva to make me too confident in him. I guess he might be an early submission threat, but he hasn't really shown he could go later in fights. Obviously, he crumbled under pressure against Molina come that second round. I just don't think that I don't think he's got really good cardio. Whereas with Altamirano, he's shown that he could go 3 hard rounds. And beyond that, I think that Altamirano, he's going to be the better striker. He's going to have more output on the feet. I definitely think he's got better cardio also, probably better durability. So, for those reasons, I do think Altamirano is the side. I'd be a little cautious, about taking him at this price just because I do think we still have to have some questions answered in regards to his, submission game. And I feel his takedown defense and bottom game still is a bit of a liability to be laying the sort of chalk on, but I do think he gets it done. I think he likely gets it done by round 3 knockout. I think that Da Silva, he's just going to go a little too hard like he's always prone to doing, and he's going to slow down, he's going to gas out, and I think Altamirano is going to be able to just pick up the volume and the pressure come that second and third round and eventually get Da Silva out of there. So give me Altamirano by round 3 knockout. And in the next fight, we have Aoriqileng versus Perrin. And Aoriqileng's the minus 200 favorite. Perrin's the plus 170 underdog. And we'll start with Aoriqileng, who does appear to be a moderately well-rounded fighter. He's got decent output and pace. He's shown he can mix in a bit of the wrestling, but I don't think it's really all that high level. He did fight pretty competitively in both of his losses to Durden and Molina. He did put on a scrap, showed a lot of toughness and heart in those fights. But I think what ultimately lost him those fights was just that, one, he's a bit hittable, and the takedown defense didn't really hold up, and the cardio, I think, was a little bit of a factor too. I don't think he's got terrible cardio, but it does look like he slows down, going into that second and third round. He does become a bit more labored with his movement. He becomes even more hittable than he originally is. And again, he does fight through it pretty well, but, I'm looking at the Molina fight where he had a pretty strong first round, but kind of fell off a bit, and Molina was able to kind of just piece him up in that second and third round. And then in the Durden fight, Durden was able to hit takedowns early and secure that round. But we did see Aoriqileng slow down a little bit. He did have a much stronger second round, but that was, I think, more so Durden just not having much left in the tank. Durden, I think, took most of that second round off, and Aoriqileng was able to get more of his offense going. But come that third round, he was slowing down also, and Durden was able to hit takedowns. It ended up being a very sloppy fight between two guys who I think were pretty gassed. But Aoriqileng, he has shown that he can get into these dogfights and make it to a decision. And I do think that Molina, a pretty solid fighter, and Durden, he is a pretty solid wrestler too. So, not bad performances by any means. And he's going up against Jay Perrin, who does appear to be a pretty well-rounded fighter. It's kind of hard to get a great read on him. I think his background is in boxing, but I feel like in a number of fights he does look to mix in the wrestling, and there are actually a lot of grappling exchanges in his fights. Usually it's his opponents initiating these grappling exchanges, but I have seen Perrin look to hit takedowns as well. But Perrin, he does seem to have a bit of power in his hands. He's got a nice low leg kick. He does have decent timing on his level change, and he does seem pretty slippery and scrambly on the mat also. He is coming off of a loss to Batista, but that was a fight that he took on short notice. And while I do feel that was a pretty clear 30-27 for Batista, it wasn't. I don't think it was necessarily a very dominant performance. Like, I felt that Perrin, he did have his moments in the fight, and while overall I felt that the fight never really got out of Batista's hand, I do think that Perrin put up a pretty solid performance, all things considered. He kept it somewhat competitive for someone coming in on like a few days' notice, and I do kind of rate Batista as a fighter overall. So I do think Perrin's a decent fighter. I think that, he seems to have a bit of power in his hands. It's kind of hard to say. It seems like a lot of his opponents do tend to initiate the grappling against him, and I suspect that it's because they do kind of respect his power. Maybe they've felt it a bit and decide that they don't really want to stand and trade with him. So I do think that between the two, Perrin might have a little more power. And part of the reason I say that is because, Aoriqileng, he landed a ton of strikes against Molina, wasn't really able to hurt him. He had Durden pretty gassed in that second round, wasn't able to really do much with it. He did pick up the offense, but Durden himself was actually able to land some pretty big bombs on Aoriqileng in that second round also. So, I don't think Aoriqileng's got a ton of power. I know he's coming off of a knockout against Cameron Else, but Cameron Else is not a UFC caliber fighter, in my opinion. Definitely does not have the durability to back it up either. And he was cutting down to I think 125 for the first time. So yeah, a lot of durability concerns for Else. So not gonna really rate that performance. So between the two, yeah, I think I kind of favor Perrin in terms of power. I think Perrin's the more well-rounded fighter also. I think he's got a little more wrestling and grappling upside. Aoriqileng, he has hit some takedowns, but hasn't really shown much top control. So overall, I think I rate Perrin a little more in terms of the wrestling and the grappling. Volume I definitely give to Aoriqileng. I think he's the more accurate, the sharper striker in there. I also think his hands are a little quicker, but overall, I think this is going to be a pretty competitive fight. I think this is going to be a dogfight, honestly. I think it's going to be pretty 50-50. So for those reasons, I'm going to go with Jay Perrin here to pick up the decision win. I just really don't like how hittable Aoriqileng is. I don't like his takedown defense, especially later in fights. He was giving up takedowns relatively easily against Durden. Later in the fight, gave up a ton of control time later in the fight that ultimately lost him the fight. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a very close fight, and I think in the spot, if it's a close fight, I'm going to side with the big underdog in Jay Perrin. So give me Perrin by decision. And moving along, we have Francisco Figueiredo versus Amir Albazi. And Albazi's the -350 favorite. Figueiredo's the +285 underdog. And we'll start with Figueiredo, also known as the Bad Figgy. So mean, but so true at the same time. Definitely, he's got a similar style to Davison standing. The stance, the movement, just far less effective. He does do good attritional work. He will attack the legs. He will go to the body, but in most of the fights that I've seen, they end up being pretty sloppy grind fests. Lots of clinch work, lots of cage pushing, and a bit of lay and pray also. So generally just not a very fun fighter to watch. He is coming off of a quick knee bar win over at De Silva, but I'm not sure how much you could really take away from that. De Silva doesn't seem to be all that good. However, I think we'll get a better picture when, after this card, right? Because De Silva is also going to be on the same card. But as of now, I think we have a bit of incomplete information, but overall, I'm just not really all that sold on Figueiredo here. And that's not to say he isn't a skilled fighter or anything, but I think the big issue is just that his cardio isn't great. He's not really able to fight effectively for 3 rounds. He's barely hanging on to fights past that, round and a half mark. And I feel like he's also gotten some pretty favorable matchmaking also against some pretty lower level guys. And he's going up against Albazi, who I think is a pretty legitimate prospect. Still somewhat unproven, but I really have liked what I've seen from his game overall. I really like the improvements coming from him. He started off as a grappler, but I feel his striking has really come a long ways. I remember going into the Zumagulov fight. I was on the Zumagulov side. I felt that Zumagulov, just way more experience. I thought that Zumagulov would be the better striker also. Based off of some of the regional striking footage of Albazi, I just thought that, he'd be a little too stiff in there, a little too slow for Zumagulov. And, Zumagulov did look good that first round, but Albazi made some good adjustments in that fight. He showed some really good improvements in his hand speed, his ability to just kind of adjust going into that second and third round, right? And, I felt that was a win that aged very, very well for Albazi. On top of that, he's a very good grappler, so I do like everything I've seen from Albazi. The issue is he is coming off of a 1.5 year long layoff, which is a little concerning, but at this young of an age, I don't think it'll be as big of an issue. Albazi's only 28. When it comes to these older guys, I'm a little more concerned, but these young guys, I'm a little less. So, coming off this long layoff, I'm actually expecting, maybe even more improvements. But taking a look at this matchup, I do think that it should be Albazi all day. I think that he's just the better fighter everywhere. At this point, I think he's the better striker. I think his boxing's just a bit slicker. And I think that he might also be the better grappler also. But I think the most important factor here is just going to be the cardio. I think that Albazi's got way better cardio than Figueiredo. I don't think Figueiredo is going to be able to bully Albazi in the clinch like he did against some of his previous opponents. I just think that Albazi's going to be able to push a much higher pace, and I don't think Figueiredo is going to be able to keep up. Past that second round, past that first round and a half, I think that Albazi's just going to be landing a lot more. He's going to be hitting takedowns, getting top control time. So I like Albazi in the spot. Among other things, I think he's also got a lot of other advantages. Outside of that, he's going to be the younger fighter. I think he's going to be the bigger guy also. And just in terms of level of competition, I rate him much higher. They have a similar opponent in Gordon, who Albazi was able to make pretty quick work of, whereas Figueiredo kind of went life and death with him. So I got to go with Albazi here. The layoff, again, is a bit of a concern, but at the end of the day, I think that Albazi's the side here. I think that he's the one making improvements. He's the much younger fighter. I think that he's likely better everywhere, better cardio. So give me Albazi here. Give me Albazi by round 3 finish. I think he can get it done by either ground and pound or submission. I just don't think that Figueiredo is going to be able to keep up, and I just see Albazi likely overwhelming him. So give me Albazi by round 3 submission. And moving right along, we have AJ Fletcher versus Ange Loosa, and Fletcher's the -150 favorite, Loosa's the +130 underdog, and we'll start with the slight favorite in Fletcher. So with Fletcher, he is primarily a wrestler. He's throwing big power shots on the feet, big winging overhands, heavy leg kicks, generally just looking to close the distance and get his wrestling going. He's got good timing on the level change. He's got a nice reactive double, and he is very heavy on top, but I do think that his grappling still is a little green. We saw him get reversed by Semmelsberger in a fight that really could have swung his way had he had just not lost position in that exchange. And I feel his cardio is a little sketchy also. On top of that, I think his bottom game doesn't look good either, right? But, I will admit Fletcher, he is a pretty strong wrestler. He is quite physical, and, he does have, I think, a lot of skills and tools to build off of. But overall, I feel he still is a bit unpolished and still is a little green in certain areas. And he's going to be going up against Loosa, who is primarily a striker. He fights very composed in there. Can be a bit low output as a result, but he does fight pretty well behind the jab, 1-2 leg kick. The cardio seems okay, and he has shown that he could wrestle a little bit also. Pretty limited footage on his takedown defense and get-ups, but it does seem like he's got a decent sprawl and does know how to work his way back up. But again, I do want to mention it is, in pretty limited footage and against low-level guys, but I do feel it is a good thing to see coming from him. But taking a look at this matchup, we have a wrestler versus a striker, essentially. Fletcher going to be the much better wrestler, and Loosa's, I think, going to be the better striker in this matchup. On the feet, Fletcher's really just throwing some big wild shots, looking to close the distance. So I don't know if Fletcher's going to have too much success standing. But of course, he does have a pretty big wrestling advantage. Loosa's going to have a pretty significant reach advantage, which I do think is going to be a pretty big factor here, right? He could, I think, have a lot more success on the outside, pumping out the jab. And from what I have seen, Loosa does have a pretty low stance that he fights out of, which I think could help in this matchup also. But even if Fletcher is able to hit takedowns here, I'm not entirely convinced he can maintain that sort of control, at least, over the course of 2-3 rounds. He might have some success early, but, from what I've seen in the Semmelsberger fight, and I guess that's really the only fight to go off of. Most of Fletcher's fights have ended early, and that's another issue going into this fight for Fletcher, right, is just that he hasn't really looked good past that first round in the one fight that did get extended. Obviously, I think Semmelsberger's a solid fighter, but Semmelsberger doesn't have the best cardio either, and he was able to reverse Fletcher. He was able to actually hit takedowns on Fletcher and kind of just get on top of him, and Fletcher just did not look good on bottom either. And Loosa, he has shown some wrestling, so, later in fights as it gets extended, if Loosa is able to somehow hit a takedown or get on top of Fletcher, I don't know if Fletcher's going to be able to get up. So for those reasons, I got to side with Loosa here. I honestly think it's a pretty 50-50 fight where I would give Fletcher the advantage early. He does start pretty aggressively. He has shown that, he's pretty explosive early, and he does have a pretty strong top game. But, if he isn't able to finish Loosa and pound him out in that first round, I see Loosa being able to take over come that second and third round. Granted, Loosa's not exactly like an output or pace machine in there, but he has shown, I guess, decent takedown defense and get-ups, and I do think that he'll be providing enough resistance, when it comes to the takedowns and, the get-ups, that we will see Fletcher start to slow down. So, yeah, I think I'm going to go with Loosa in this spot here. I think he's going to be able to stuff takedowns come that second and third round and be able to keep it standing long enough to win the win rounds that way. I think that Loosa could potentially hit takedowns also. Not going to bank on it too much, but I do think that's something he could potentially do here. So I'm going to go with Loosa by decision. And in the next fight, we have Shanna Young versus Miranda Maverick. And Maverick's the minus 350 favorite. Young is the plus 285 underdog. And we'll start with Shanna Young, who is primarily a striker. However, I think her striking's pretty basic. She does like to throw out that lead leg sidekick. But overall, I don't think that her striking is particularly dangerous. She does seem kind of plotty in there also. But I'd say that the biggest weakness and probably the biggest factor going into this fight is going to be the takedown defense of Young. She's got quite poor takedown defense. She gets taken down in pretty much all of her fights. She really struggles off her back. She got submitted by Sarah Alpar, who I don't think is a particularly good fighter. She gave up a lot of control time against Chesson, who is a striker, and then she got ground and pounded out by Stephanie Yeager. Granted, this was all at 135, but Maverick is a pretty big and physical 125er, and I think the main thing is Maverick has actually already beaten Shanna Young. Young, she is coming off of a TKO against Mazzani. Mazzani, she is an okay wrestler and is someone who will push the wrestling and the grappling, but Mazzani is also a proven gasser, someone who will fall apart, later in fights, and she just wasn't able to maintain that sort of wrestling and grappling pace, and eventually got finished by Young. And I don't really see that happening here. Maverick, she's a very strong wrestler, very strong grappler herself. Striking's improving, still a bit on the hittable side, but I just think that there's going to be a massive advantage in the wrestling here. I think that Maverick, she's got pretty good timing on her level change. She's very strong and physical, very heavy on top. She's active also. She's going to look to hunt submissions. And Maverick has shown that she's, making improvements in there as well. So I don't know if there's too much else to say here. Maverick's already beaten Young, like I said. And since then, I feel like Maverick's the one making more improvements. On top of that, Maverick's been more active since then. She's been in there with better opponents since they've last fought. And overall, I just feel that Maverick's got Young covered pretty much everywhere. I even think that in terms of the striking, Maverick could potentially get the better of Young. But I think the path of least resistance here is going to be the grappling. I think that Maverick is going to be able to hit takedowns. I think that she's going to be able to have her way with Shanna Young on the mat. And I think that Maverick is going to get the finish once again, like she did in the first fight. So I'm going to go with Maverick in the spot. I'm going to go with Maverick by round 2 TKO. I think she likely gets the ground and pound finish. On top of that, Maverick's shown pretty good cardio. She's shown she could push a pretty strong pace over the course of 3 rounds. So yeah, I'm going to go with Maverick in the spot. I think that I don't think too much has changed since the first fight, aside from the fact that I think Maverick's actually made more improvements since then. So give me Maverick by round 2 TKO. And moving right along, we have Luis Saldaña versus Sean Woodson. And Woodson's the minus 300 favorite. Saldaña's the plus 250 underdog. And we'll start with Saldaña first, who is a pretty solid striker. Honestly, I think he's got a good kicking game. He really likes to kick to the body. He's got a very heavy low kick. He's able to switch stances also. And overall, I do think he's a pretty dynamic offensive striker. But the issue with Saldaña is he's got pretty horrendous cardio. Round 1, he typically looks pretty good. He lets his hands go. The kicking game's very good early, but he falls off, I'd say, pretty massively after that. We saw in his fight against Lingo, he looked good in that first round, and then, completely fell off the cliff. Second and third rounds, Lingo was able to take over. And it kind of happened against Souza as well. Started off pretty strong, kind of fell off. But, he still was able to win that fight, but Souza's just not someone who's really going to push much of a pace either. And that fight was actually a very close fight. A lot of people thought that Souza potentially won that fight also. So, that was a very close one. Same with the Griffin fight also, right? A fight that could easily have gone Griffin's way. So Saldaña, it could easily have been, 1-2 in the UFC or even 0-3 at the UFC level, but did have a few favorable decisions go his way. And on the other side, we have Sean Woodson, who's a very good boxer, right? The guy's got a pretty insane frame for the division, very unorthodox style, a lot of movement, a lot of feints. He's pretty sharp, though, very good volume also. The takedown defense is solid. He will struggle a bit off his back if you're able to get him down, but I don't think that's going to be too big of an issue here. We have seen Saldaña shoot takedowns, but I don't think he's a very prolific wrestler or anything, and the tall frame of Woodson really is advantageous for him in stuffing the takedowns, and Woodson does seem to have pretty good balance himself. But taking a look at this matchup, I think that this is pretty straightforward. I think that it's going to be Saldaña early. He's going to look good like he usually does, and then I think that if he isn't able to get Woodson out of there, we're going to see Woodson just take over eventually with the pressure, the pace, and the output come the second and third rounds. I think the kicks from Saldaña could give some trouble to Woodson early. Again, Saldaña does have a really strong low leg kick, and Woodson, he does seem to have, very thin, gangly legs, which could give him trouble, right? Someone like Woodson, boxer heavy, stands a bit heavy on that lead leg. I think that's something Saldaña could just chop at early, but if he isn't able to get Woodson out of there, I just think that the volume is going to add up, and he's just going to continue to touch Saldaña up as the fight progresses. Woodson, he has shown pretty good output over the course of 3 rounds. We've seen him go into the 3rd round and still be able to maintain that pace. And, Saldaña, on the other hand, is kind of just falls off a cliff after that 1st round. So he'll be a bit of a sitting duck in that 2nd and 3rd round. So I just see Woodson being able to land at will come that 2nd and 3rd round. I see this playing out somewhat similarly to the Lingo fight, where Saldaña, he'll probably take the 1st round, but if he isn't able to get Woodson out of there, I think Woodson's going to be able to start to just land at will come that 2nd and 3rd round. So I'm going to go with Woodson in this fight. I'm going to go with Woodson by either decision or late knockout. I think that if Saldaña slows down enough, we could see Woodson maybe just hurt him and kind of flurry him later in the fight. So I'm going to go with Woodson in the spot. Official pick, I think I'm going to go with Woodson by 3rd round knockout. And in the next fight, we have Lucie Pudilová versus Yanan. And Pudilova's the -155 favorite. Yanan's the +135 underdog. And we'll start with Pudilová, who is actually making her return to the UFC. This is going to be her 2nd stint there. Flamed out pretty hard in her 1st run. Was able to rack up a few wins on the regionals and make her return. Pudilová, she's a pretty tall, lanky striker with a decent output. She's quite aggressive in there. But the issue with Pudilová is she's pretty hittable herself, and she has struggled with the grappling in the UFC at least. However, she went back to the regionals, was able to rack up a few wins, has made some improvements since then. Her striking does look a little sharper, and it does look like she's able to mix in some of the wrestling and grappling in her fights. But it is worth noting, however, this is against lower level regional competition. And she still did have a loss over on the regionals where she was taken down in control like she was at the UFC level. So I feel like that's a part of her game that hasn't really been shored up. And at this point, I doubt it's going to be shored up at any point. So, still a big concern here for Pudilová. But she is going up against Yanan, who is really not much of a threat there. Both the times that the fight has hit the floor on the Yanan side, she almost got armbarred. I'm talking about the Edwards fight and the Silva fight. She was able to stay safe, but Yanan herself has not looked particularly great on the ground. Yanan, more of a volume striker herself, a very erratic movement, lots of feints on the feet, but I find it all pretty ineffective. I think that she doesn't have a ton of power. She does seem to whiff on a lot of her shots also. Overall, I just don't think Yanan's that good of a fighter. I think that she's just kind of slow, a little clumsy. I think her striking's a bit telegraphed also. And, for as big as she is, she doesn't really use her size all that effectively either. But I will give Yanan this, though. She is pretty tough. She will throw in for flurries. But overall, I just think that she's a bit one-dimensional and a bit unskilled. On top of that, I don't think she's really shown too many improvements or really any process to her game. But taking a look at this matchup, I think that Pudilová is the side. I think that in terms of the striking, she's going to be a lot sharper, a lot crisper in there. However, Pudilová is barely UFC caliber, if that. An argument can be made that she's not UFC caliber at all. But during her run in the UFC, she actually had some pretty competitive striking affairs with Jian Kim and Irene Aldana, both pretty solid strikers in my opinion. But what ended up happening was she just got out-grappled in too many of her fights. And, I don't know if Yanan's going to be much of a grappling threat. Some of her fights have actually hit the ground, but Yanan's not someone that really proactively wrestles in there. That said, though, I think both fighters have a big enough hole in their takedown defense and defensive grappling that I don't know if I'd be too confident on each side. I feel that if either fighter is able to hit takedowns here, they're going to be able to swing rounds in their favor. So I do have a slight lean towards Pudilová. I just think that her striking is going to be a little sharper and a little more technical than Yanan. But, Yanan, she does have some decent forward pressure, some decent volume. But yeah, I don't think either fighter is particularly good. But if I had to pick a side here, I'm going to go with Pudilová. But this is a pretty low level fight. I honestly like the over a little more in this fight. I don't think either fighter's got too much finishing upside. I don't think either's got a ton of power. Both do seem to be pretty durable, and I don't know if there's really much submission upside between the two either. So I'm going to go with Pudilová here. Pudilová by decision, but again, not a very confident pick. And in the next fight, we have Leonardo Santos versus Jared Gordon. And Gordon's the minus 310 favorite. Santos is the plus 260 underdog. And we'll start with the big underdog in Santos, who has had a pretty interesting career, right? He's beaten some pretty good fighters back in the day. The guy's shown some power in his hands. He's got a very dangerous submission game also, but the issue with Santos is just that he's been very inactive, taken a lot of time off. He's fighting like once a year. And again, another concern is just that the age and the cardio at this point. He's 42 years old, which is very old, especially at lightweight. And it definitely doesn't help that the cardio's no good either for him. We've really seen him struggle to keep it together past that first round. Obviously, he's coming off of a loss against Guido where he kind of punched himself out in that first round and then kind of gassed out. Guido was able to get the round 2 submission. And then even in the Dawson fight, Dawson was able to push a pretty crazy pace against him and then eventually get the very late knockout. But Santos wasn't looking particularly great, past that first round and a half. And then even in his fight against Bogatov, which he did win, that was just a very, very sloppy fight. You saw that he was very visibly fatigued, and Bogatov's not really a good fighter either. So big concern here for Santos, especially since he's going up against Jared Gordon, who's kind of known for pushing a pace. Gordon's got very good cardio. He's very well-rounded also. He could box, he could wrestle. So I do feel that Gordon's got all the tools to succeed here. He's going to be the much younger fighter also. However, I do have to say this. I think the durability of Gordon is a bit of a concern, right? He's kind of had a history of getting finished by these Brazilians also. So Santos does have that going for him. But yeah, Gordon's been chinned a few times, and Santos does have some power. But beyond that first round, I just don't know if Santos is going to be much of a threat for someone like Gordon, who's going to be able to push a pretty crazy pace. And this is definitely, I think, a pretty common theme in this card. We have a lot of guys who are, I'd say, round 1 finish or bust versus guys who have good cardio. And most of the time, I'm going to lean with the guy who's got proven 3-round cardio, a guy who's able to maintain that sort of pace and pressure over the course of 3 rounds. Not to mention, Gordon, I think, is a pretty solid fighter himself, right? So I do think that if he's able to stay safe early, avoid that big shot from Santos, I do expect him to likely be able to take over. I think that, especially if he's able to mix in the takedowns, he should be able to maybe break Santos come that second or third round. That said, though, I think I'm actually going to lean more towards Gordon by decision in this fight. Gordon, while he does have pretty good cardio, I don't think he's got the cardio that Dawson has. And, Dawson almost didn't get that finish, right? Santos was very close to surviving to a decision against Dawson. And I don't think Gordon's quite on that level in terms of the pressure and pace that he puts on with the wrestling and the grappling. And so I do think that it likely ends up going to a decision here. Santos will probably, still have enough cardio to defend and not get finished. So I'm going to go with Gordon, 29-28 decision. That first round could get a little dicey. And I will say this about Santos. He does have power in his hands. And I feel that Gordon is going to have to respect it early. But ultimately, I think that if Gordon is able to avoid that big bomb early and get his wrestling going, I think that it's going to be his fight. So I'm going to go with Gordon here, Gordon by decision. And moving right along, we have Tyson Pedro versus Harry Hunsucker. And Pedro's the minus 800 favorite. Hunsucker's the plus 500 underdog. And we'll start with the big favorite in Pedro first, who is a somewhat well-rounded action fighter. He's got quick, heavy hands, can grapple a bit also. However, he can be a little low volume and is somewhat hittable himself. Pedro, he was on a 3.5-year-long layoff, and coming off of his most recent knockout, I feel like we still haven't really seen too much from him, since his layoff. He was able to blast a fragile Ike Villanueva out of there early. Did show a bit of composure going into that fight, right, where, as some of his older fights, he kind of went in there guns blazing, ended up, gassing out in some fights and got finished. So he took it a bit slower in that fight, which I guess is good to see, but overall, I feel like we haven't learned too much else from him. That said, though, it does seem like the power's still there. He still looks pretty sharp, so that's good to see. And he's going up against Hunsucker, who if I'm being honest, I don't really know what he does well. He does seem to throw with some heat, but he does load up big on his punches. They're very telegraphed, and he's got a number of submission wins on the regionals, but I doubt he's some prolific grappler. That's against some pretty low-level guys. Looking at his record, I don't think he's really beaten anyone good. There's only, I think, 2 guys on there with winning records. One of them's 4-3, and the other's 1-0. So very, very low-level guys. He's beating out there. He's got knockout losses to Vandera and Tafa, who guys, I don't really rate in there. And he's moving down to light heavyweight. So Hunsucker, who's got a pretty suspect chin to begin with, is cutting down to light heavyweight, going up against a very heavy hitter in Pedro. I feel like it's not going to be good for him, right? So I do think this is a bit of a squash match. It's pretty clear the UFC's trying to, I guess, rebuild Pedro a little bit here. They gave him a layup match in his return fight, and they're giving him another one. So I think they're trying to build the highlight reel a little bit before giving him that step up in competition. But honestly, I don't know if there's too much to break down here. I think that Pedro round 1 knockout is going to be the likely outcome. I just think that Pedro is the much more skilled fighter, the more well-rounded fighter. And I think he's just going to be a bit quicker also. And, on top of that, Pedro's actually got the slightly bigger frame. I think that even though Hunsucker is moving down from heavyweight, Pedro's actually going to be the taller, longer guy. On top of that, he's got more UFC experience. He's going to be the younger guy here. I just think that all the advantages are on Pedro's side. And obviously, Hunsucker can land something big. He does throw with heat, but outside of him just clipping Pedro with something, I just don't really see a very clear path to victory for him. Maybe Pedro, he goes a little hard early and gasses himself out. Maybe that happens and he ends up getting finished or something, but I don't really see it. I think Pedro likely gets the finish here. Hunsucker, again, doesn't have the best chin. Granted, he's getting blasted by heavyweights, but cutting down to 205, I don't think is going to be great for him either. We saw him actually struggle a bit with the leg kicks from Tuivasa, and Pedro's got some decent leg kicks himself. Obviously was able to finish Ike Villanueva with leg kicks and follow-up shots, so I think that's something he could do. Just look to take the legs out from under Hunsucker and then go up top. Pedro probably not going to pack as much of a punch as guys like Tuivasa and Tafa, but I do think he's got the speed advantage. And again, I think Hunsucker cutting down to 205 could compromise his already compromised chin. So give me Pedro here. Give me Pedro by round 1 knockout. And obviously, I think it goes without saying you can't really play Pedro at these odds here. It's gotten pretty ridiculous, but I do think Pedro's the side, and I think he gets it done by round 1 knockout. And in the next fight, we have Alexandr Romanov versus Marcin Tybura. And Romanov's the minus 335 favorite. Tybura's the plus 275 underdog. And we'll start with Tybura, who's a very well-rounded fighter. The boxing serviceable. He has been chinned a few times, but was able to survive against Hardy and Harris and eventually get the finish in those fights. Was able to hang with Volkov on the feet. So I do think that Tybura is a pretty solid fighter. He can mix in the wrestling also. He's got some decent clinch work. Grappling is solid. Cardio is all right. And he's been in there with some pretty solid fighters. And, it's pretty proven at the UFC level. So I feel like where the line is now, it does seem like he's maybe getting a little disrespected. But Romanov, I do think he's a solid fighter, right? He's a very explosive wrestler. Very big action takedowns. He's picking guys up, slamming them. He's got some nasty ground and pound. But he's largely looked good against guys with very little takedown defense and ground game. Guys like Chase Sherman, Jared Vandera, Rogerio de Lima, and Roque Martinez. And, the one guy that was able to put up a fight in Espino, it got real sketchy for, Romanov. And, I like Espino. I think he's a solid fighter. But at the end of the day, that was a 40-year-old Espino in there with one UFC fight under his belt, really giving Romanov a run for his money. And, Romanov definitely pulled a bit of a stunt there, which is not a great look. But I will say this, I think that was potentially a learning experience. Romanov, he is a solid wrestler. And, coming out of that performance, I feel like maybe it was a bit of a wake-up call. You can't just go in there and just throw guys around, like throw these higher level guys around like you were against, these bums like Vandera and Chase Sherman, right? So I do feel that Romanov's got a really solid foundation to build off of, and coming off of that Espino fight, I feel like it's something that he can improve off of, work on his pacing a little bit. I feel that, instead of just, going for these, high-powered takedowns and, going all out with the ground and pound, he could pace himself a little better, work on, consolidating control a little more as opposed to just trying to hunt the finish, in which case, I think he could have a somewhat dominant performance here because, I do think there's a very clear path in the wrestling here, but I do think, Tybura will put up resistance. I don't think Tybura's really ever been dominated in the wrestling before. Granted, I think that Romanov's probably going to be one of the better wrestlers he's gone up against. So, I do think this is a winnable fight for Romanov, but I do feel it is a little disrespectful to have the line where it is lined right now. Because, again, I do think that Tybura will put up resistance similar to Espino, and I do think that Tybura is going to be the better striker in this matchup. Definitely the more proven striker, right? And I do think that Tybura's cardio is a little more proven also. If Tybura is able to hit takedowns or reversals, I haven't liked what I saw from Romanov on bottom too much. I think it was in the Espino fight. That first round was pretty dicey. I think a lot of people scored it in favor of Espino because he was able to get some top control time on Romanov. Romanov was, I think, able to explode out, later in that round. But yeah, I don't know, man. He gave up a lot of control time to Espino, and I do think that Tybura is a decent top side grappler. But overall, I do think this is a pretty big step up in competition for Romanov. Definitely a winnable fight, right? I think that Romanov is capable of hitting takedowns and getting control time over the course of 2 rounds in this fight, right? Because I'm looking at the Espino fight, which was a fight which had very close margins, in my opinion. That first round was, very swingy, could have gone 50-50, but he was able to get control time in that second round. Obviously, that third round, we didn't get to see too much of it play out. It did look like Romanov was slowing down a little bit. So, yeah, I feel like the third round probably would have been Espino's, but I do think that the first 2 rounds, I think Romanov should be fresh enough, good enough with the wrestling to get top control time and hit takedowns to win the first 2 rounds. So I think I'm going to go with Romanov by decision in this spot, but I think I'll probably have to pass on this fight, or if anything, maybe put a small bet on Tybura by decision, because I do think that this fight will be somewhat competitive. I don't think that Romanov's going to come in here and dominate Tybura. So official pick, I think I'm still going to go with Romanov. I think he gets it done by 29-28 decision. And moving right along, we have Merab Dvalishvili versus José Aldo. And Dvalishvili's the -130 favorite. Aldo's the +110 underdog. And very compelling matchup here. Dvalishvili slowly climbing the rankings here. Aldo probably 1 win away from maybe a title shot here. So I like this matchup. I like the potential implications for the rest of the division here. But we'll start with Merab, who is, I think we all know Merab's game at this point. He's a very high-paced wrestler, someone who's going to go in there and just spam takedowns. The guy's got amazing cardio also. He's able to work the takedowns through all 3 rounds. And we saw in his most recent fight against Moraes, he's got an insane chin, insane recoverability also. But the issue that I'm starting to have with Merab at this point is the guy's just got absolutely no hands. I feel his striking is pretty much a non-factor. Like, the gap between Merab's wrestling and his striking is just immense. And on the feet, I just don't think he's much of a threat outside of him maybe landing one of those spinning back fists, which he does like to spam occasionally. But overall, I just don't think his striking is quite as developed as where his wrestling is at right now. And honestly, his wrestling and cardio has really carried him so far, but I do feel that he's taking that step up in competition now where, I don't know if it's going to be able to carry him, against these upper echelon fighters, right? That said, though, he does have a very clear path in his wrestling, his pace, and his cardio. But we did see in some of his most recent fights that in the extended striking exchanges, he's looked just very unimpressive. In fights where he isn't able to hit takedowns, he's looked far less impressive, right? Like against Dodson, where he just wasn't really able to get his wrestling going. It ended up being a pretty low-paced, striking affair. He was able to get some cage pushing time, cage control time, but overall didn't look that great. And then against Moraes early in the fight where, he wasn't able to get his wrestling going yet when Moraes was still fresh. He got hurt, obviously. Moraes was landing some pretty big shots on him also. Obviously, Moraes, the guy's a bit of a gas job. Wasn't able to keep it together, past that first burst of offense, and eventually slowed down enough that Merab was able to take him down and just pound him out. And this is an interesting matchup because he is going up against Aldo, who is a very dangerous striker in his own right. And Aldo's got phenomenal takedown defense. The guy's got great hips, good balance, and has had a history of just beating good wrestlers back in the day, right? I don't think anyone's really had a very dominant wrestling performance against Aldo. That said, though, Aldo, he is getting a bit up there in age, and at this stage in his career, you do have to wonder how his takedown defense is going to hold up. He hasn't fought too many wrestlers lately, but, he does. The takedown defense is there, right? The main question is, does he have the strength and the cardio to defend maybe 15, 20 takedown attempts from someone like Dvalishvili, who has been known to shoot that many takedowns, right? But on the feet, I do favor Aldo pretty significantly. Merab, he was actually having a pretty hard time on the feet against guys like Dodson and Moraes, and I kind of do rate Aldo above these guys even at this stage in his career. I think that Aldo's going to be landing just way more effective shots standing. He's going to be the much heavier hitter, the much more technical striker. And unlike Aldo, unlike Moraes, I don't see Aldo going for the kill early and gassing himself out. Aldo, he has struggled a bit with the cardio in his fights, and Merab is known for pushing a pretty intense pace. So that is worth noting here. But I think that if Aldo is able to defend takedowns for 2 rounds and just look to outbox Merab, I can definitely see him winning a decision here, which I'm kind of leaning towards. Aldo, on top of that, he's got some very nasty leg kicks, which I think could affect Merab here. We saw Dvalishvili have, or not Dvalishvili, Moraes have a bit of success on the feet with the kicks, and I think that if you're able to kind of kick the legs from under Merab, you could maybe mitigate a little bit of the wrestling threat. And even if Merab is able to hit takedowns, I don't think the control from Merab's is particularly great. A lot of opponents have been able to work their way back up. He's just been able to kind of spam takedowns against them, and usually he's able to win fights because his opponents are spending most of the fight defending takedowns and working their way back up. But against someone like Aldo, I feel if he's able to stuff the initial takedown and kind of work his way back to space and land some big shots, I think he could definitely swing rounds in his favor. I just don't think that, the judges will really favor the, the cage pushing, the takedown attempts from Merab if Aldo is able to, get a few minutes of striking time where he's able to just land the bigger shots. Because on the feet, I really don't think that Merab is going to be able to do enough to offset the damage that Aldo's potentially going to be able to do, right? So the official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Jose Aldo here to pick up the win. I think he gets it done by decision. I think that the first 2 rounds, it's going to be pretty close, but I think he'll be able to keep it standing long enough to do enough damage and win a couple of rounds on the scorecards that way. So give me Aldo in the spot. Give me Aldo by decision. And in the co-main event, we have Luke Rockhold versus Paulo Costa, and Costa's the -300 favorite. Rockhold's the +250 underdog, and we'll start with the big favorite in Costa first. So with Costa, he's a very pressure-heavy fighter. He likes to stalk opponents, back them down, and just throw volume. I like that he rips to the body. He's got solid cage cutting, and he's got decent power in his hands also. That said, though, I do actually consider him more of an attritional fighter than a power puncher, per se, at least at the UFC level, right? He does have power in his hands. I'm not denying that, but I don't think he's got one punch knockout power necessarily. A lot of his knockouts have been from him just kind of overwhelming opponents and them kind of crumbling under the pressure. That said, Costa does have some potential cardio concerns. His output and his volume does tend to dip later in fights, but it is expected, right? The guy throws a ton of volume early, and he does throw with heat. That said, though, he has actually been able to gut it out in fights that do get extended. I'm looking at the The Yoel Romero fight, granted, that fight did get multiple not stoppages, but there were multiple pauses in that fight because of, I think, low blows and eye pokes and stuff. But he did look solid against Vettori. Granted, that was, again, a fight at catch weight, or no, it was at light heavyweight where he didn't have to cut a ton of weight. So a bit of an asterisk in those fights, but Costa, while he does look like he slows down, he has been able to fight through the fatigue pretty well, all things considered. And something else worth noting here is that Costa actually hasn't made weight in a couple of years now, right? Since the Izzy fight, his fight against Vettori recently was actually at light heavyweight, where there was the whole weight cutting debacle and everything. But Costa just hasn't made the middleweight limit in years now. So something to note here. But he is going up against Rockhold, who he himself hasn't made weight or hasn't even fought in quite a while now. I think 3 years at this point. But Rockhold, he is a solid wrestler, solid grappler. The striking's very serviceable, and the guy was at one point the middleweight champ, so he does have a ton of high-level experience, but the issue is he's just taken a long time off. He's been riddled with injuries, and I feel for this matchup, it is going to be very much a narrative-based matchup here. I've said it before in previous matchups where, we have guys past their primes coming off of a very long layoff. The stylistics of it don't tend to matter as much, just because you do have to question, their mentality going into this fight, how their body is going to hold up coming in. And usually I do talk about the mentality side of things, but with Rockhold, this guy does seem like he's balls deep in the self-help stuff, probably listens to a ton of Tony Robbins and whatnot. So I'm sure he believes he can beat Costa in this spot. He probably believes he could be middleweight champion right now, but the issue is just physically, I don't think he's the same fighter anymore. The chin, obviously, is just not there. He's been knocked out on a number of occasions. He's had a number of injuries since then also, and I believe part of the reason this fight got pushed back was because Rockhold was dealing with injuries. And on top of that, he's coming off of a very long layoff, and he's coming back against a very dangerous fighter in Costa, someone who does hit hard, someone who will put the pressure on him, and someone who will look to get him out of there. So this is a very dangerous fight for him to come back to. And I know Costa's kind of been memed lately, but at the end of the day, I do think he's still a very dangerous fighter. And historically, Costa has done really well against these aging fighters that are maybe a little fragile, kind of like, guys like Hall and Hendricks. And I just think that this is going to be a little too much for Rockhold to come back to. Maybe he's able to get his wrestling and grappling going, but Costa, he has shown pretty good takedown defense. He's a pretty strong guy himself. And in this matchup, I kind of see Costa just doing what he typically does, just walking his opponents down, throwing big, heavy shots, going to the body, just pressuring them. I think we're going to see Rockhold maybe look okay in that first round, but I see the pressure and the pace eventually just overwhelming Rockhold here. So the prediction for this fight, I'm going to go with Costa by round 2 knockout. I think that the nutritional work that Costa is going to be doing is going to start to add up come that second round. Those body shots are really going to start to add up. I think we're going to see the hands of Rockhold start to drop, and Costa, he's going to start doing damage up top. And Rockhold, again, I do think his chin's kind of gone at this point, so I just don't see him taking too many shots from Costa. So official pick, I'm going to go with Costa round 2 knockout. And in the main event, we have Kamaru Usman versus Leon Edwards. Obviously getting a rematch between the two, 7 years apart, but we'll start with Edwards. Pretty solid, well-rounded fighter. The issue is he's just been somewhat inactive. That said, though, he is riding a pretty hot streak, has been undefeated since losing to Usman back in 2015. But with Edwards, he's, again, a very well-rounded fighter. He's got a very meat-and-potatoes striking game, nice jab, 1-2, low kick. But I'd say where he really excels is in the clinch. He's really just great at initiating these clinch exchanges and just landing very vicious elbows in the clinch. He can mix in the wrestling also. He's got a nice body lock takedown. He's very heavy on top. Not the most busy. And that seems to be an issue with Edwards, is just that he's generally pretty low volume. He's not someone that really puts his stamps on fights. I mean, he'll land some big shots in the clinch, cut you open and stuff. But beyond that, he just doesn't really seem to, have big moments in fights. And overall, he does seem kind of content to do just enough, right, to kind of coast in fights. That said, It's worked for him so far. He's had a ton of success with it. Fighters haven't really been able to figure it out. And I guess if it's not broken, why fix it, right? So, he's been able to make it work for him. So, I can't really knock him too much. Just leads to some generally pretty unexciting fights. And he's going up against Kamaru Usman, who has kind of struggled with, having the same issue earlier in his career also. Usman, a very prolific wrestler, very physical, insane cardio. But prior to his little knockout streak, he was more of a control-based wrestler who was a bit of a decisionator as well. So, back in the day, not the most exciting guy, but, we do know what he brings to the table and what he's capable of. And he has shown he could push that sort of pace for 3 rounds and 5 rounds. So Usman, he's proven that he's just a very reliable fighter in there. And his hands have come along quite nicely, honestly. He's got some power in his hands. Obviously, he went 5 rounds with Colby in terms of the striking. Was able to outbox him there, finished him in the first fight, and dropped him a number of times in the second also. So overall, I think that Usman, he's just a freak athlete with an elite, well-rounded skill set at this point. But taking a look at this matchup, I do feel it's potentially somewhat narrative-driven. Stylistically, I don't know if it's going to play out too differently from the first fight. Taking a look at Edwards, I don't know if there's much he's added to his game for it to play out much differently, right? Because Edwards, he's a bit of a decisionator, and I don't know if he's going to decisionate Usman. I don't think he's going to be hitting takedowns on Usman. I don't know if he's going to outstrike Usman. I feel that since they've last fought, I feel like if anything, Usman's gotten a lot more confident in his striking since then. He's shown, he's got power in his hands also. So if anything, I feel that Usman may elect to strike a little more in this fight, but I feel that if at any point the fight does start to get out of his hand, he'll probably just go to the wrestling. I don't know if Leon's, his takedown defense isn't even bad. I think that there's probably just a slight physicality difference between the two. We saw Usman just largely be able to hold Leon against the cage in that first fight. He was hitting takedowns, getting control time. And I don't really see it playing out too differently if Usman does decide to wrestle and grapple here, unless, the gap has closed enough that Leon is going to be able to stuff takedowns and get off the cage, right? Because since then, Usman obviously has gotten older, arguably, aging a bit past his prime, whereas Leon, he is going to be in his prime, right? He's going to be significantly younger. I don't think he's even 30 yet. So, there is a chance that maybe Edwards, his takedown defense, his strength and conditioning has improved to the point where he is able to fend off these takedowns from Usman. He's able to work his way off the cage and, keep it at distance. But even then, I don't know if Edwards has got a significant edge in terms of the striking. Edwards, historically not a very high volume striker. Usman, he has been hurt and wobbled, but I don't think Leon's got tremendous power or anything. If anything, Leon's been hurt also, and I think Usman at this point has shown he's got maybe a little more power in his hands than Leon. So I think that there's a chance we see Usman maybe hurt Leon standing. And, if Leon wants to initiate these clinch exchanges, I think it kind of plays into Usman's game a little bit also. So I don't know if it's going to play out too much differently, aside from the fact that maybe we see Usman maybe strike a little more just because maybe he's a little more comfortable with his striking at this point in his career. So stylistically, I just don't know if too much is different between the two as opposed to their first fight. But I guess in terms of, just a narrative standpoint, an argument can be made that Usman, he is starting to taper off a little bit, right? Obviously, he still is making improvements, but I'm talking in terms of, physically, right? I think he's coming off of a hand surgery. His knees are they're not shot, but apparently there's no cartilage there or anything. He's not able to do any sort of road work. And, no one's really been targeting the legs of Usman in any of his recent fights. And maybe that's something that, Leon could do here. Just look to just kick those legs of Usman, try to take his base out from underneath him. And then just from, I guess, a motivation standpoint, you can make an argument that Leon is going to be the hungrier fighter. He's not touched the gold before. He's been sidelined for quite a while, so he's probably going to be a little more motivated in there. Whereas with Usman, he's been to the top. He's finally getting his big paydays. He's out here filming Black Panther 2. He's largely cleared out the division. Most of his title defenses now are rematches. All that's really left for him to do is maybe beat some of these young contenders like Chimaev, and maybe even Rachmanov and stuff. But beyond that, he's largely reached the top of the division, the pinnacle of the sport. So you might be able to make a case that maybe he's not as hungry as someone as Leon, who's, on his way up. But of course, this is all speculative. And speaking of speculation, maybe Edwards, maybe he's got some tricks up his sleeve, right? Because overall, I feel like he's fought so conservatively. Maybe he's got a few maybe hidden techniques that he hasn't shown yet, right? Maybe he hasn't completely shown his hand because he hasn't needed to, right? And this whole time, Usman, he's been the champ. He's the one that everyone's gunning after. So I'd have to imagine that during this whole time, and especially after that first fight, Leon and his team are probably just working on a game plan on ways to defeat Usman, looking at his weaknesses, really analyzing his tape. So I feel like all these intangibles, you got to favor Leon a little bit, but at the end of the day, I do have to favor Usman here. Stylistically, I just think that he's got Leon probably covered in a lot of areas. And in terms of how it's going to play out, I see Usman maybe just entertaining the striking a little bit longer. He definitely seems a lot more comfortable striking at this point in his career. And I do still think that Usman can have a lot of success cage pushing and hitting takedowns if he needs to. We saw in brief moments in the Edwards Bilal fight, and even Edwards against Diaz, they were having a bit of success, holding Edwards against the cage, getting some control time there. And these guys definitely not on the level of Usman when it comes to that. So I got to go with Usman in this spot. I think that barring some major regression from Usman, he should be able to have Leon covered in most areas. I don't know how Edwards is going to be able to win minutes against Usman, honestly. But let me know what you guys think. If anyone's out there on the Edwards side, let me know what you guys think about the matchup. What his paths to victory are, because I genuinely am curious. I'm just having a really hard time, seeing the Edwards side of things. But official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with I'm going to go with Usman by decision. And that'll do it for the breakdown portion of this podcast. We just broke down UFC 278, Usman versus Edwards. So we'll get right into the recap for the previous event. And we're coming off of another very, very fun card, very exciting card. A lot of good fights here, but just an absolutely disastrous night for me. Just a horrendous night. I don't think anything went right, minus a couple of the earlier fights. But yeah, beyond that, it was pretty bad. But we'll get into it regardless. So kicking off the card, we have Youssef Zalal versus Damon Blackshear. Ended up parlaying the over in this fight and also took a small poke on Zalal by decision. The over cashed, the decision did not, because it did go to a draw. I just expected Zalal to maybe have a little more success come that second and third round. Blackshear did slow down as I expected, but still put on a solid second round performance, and Zalal was able to get the 10-8. In that third round, Zalal just not a finisher whatsoever. But it was definitely a sign for the things to come for the remainder of the night. But next fight, Jason Witt, Josh Quinlan. Quinlan gets the early knockout, much to nobody's surprise. Witt's chin is just not there anymore. Against a heavy hitter like Quinlan, it was just a matter of time before he landed that bomb. And I did bet Quinlan by knockout, super square play there. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. I mean, that was an outcome that I think a lot of people expected. So moving along, Ode Osborne, Tyson Nam. So took another L here. I was pretty big on Osborne. And, honestly, I think he just showed horrendous fight IQ there. Just went in there and just was spamming the jump knee, right? Which I feel like the Manel Kape knockout kind of messed him up a little bit, right? It felt like after that fight, he was really trying to get that one back because he was throwing it in some of his previous fights. He was spamming it in this fight as well, which, quick tangent, it really shows just good fight IQ versus bad fight IQ. In the Manel Kape fight, Kape, he set up that flying knee. He's making his reads, making adjustments in that fight, and, he was setting traps and was able to time that flying knee, whereas Osborne, he was just randomly throwing these jumping knees. Wasn't really setting it up or anything. He went to it like 3 or 4 times, as opposed to Cop, who did it that one time and it hit right. So just really, really poor fight IQ there. Left himself wide open for the counter and got put out there. So yeah, just horrendous decision making and just very, very bad fight IQ there. But moving along, Gabriel Benitez versus Charlie Ontiveros. I had the under parlayed this fight, and I also had Benitez parlayed. It did look maybe a little dicey at first. Ontiveros, he does throw with heat early, but it was only a matter of time. I don't think anyone was really surprised by this outcome either. Ontiveros, horrendous takedown defense, very poor bottom game. Had no idea how to defend once Benitez got on top of him, and Benitez eventually got the knockout. So we move along. Cynthia Calvillo, Nina Nunez. Didn't have any action on this fight. Wasn't particularly interested in it either. Ended up being Nunez's retirement fight, and somehow she still showed more fire in there than Calvillo, who honestly is just looked completely out of it. I don't know what to say. It doesn't seem like she's quite in it anymore, and I wouldn't be completely surprised if she ended up retiring after 1 or 2 more fights. But moving along, Martin Buday, Lucas Brzeski. I don't think I had any action on this fight, but definitely bad decision in my opinion. I thought Brzeski won the first 2 rounds pretty clearly. I don't know how you could have given either of the first 2 rounds to Buday. Brzeski, I think, was landing more volume those first 2 rounds. I think he was landing the harder shots. Third round you could probably give to Buday, but yeah, just a horrendous decision. Really unfortunate for anyone who bet Brzeski in the spot. But like I was saying last week, Buday's just not a good fighter. He really shouldn't be minus 300 over anyone in the division. But moving along, Angela Hill, Lupita Godinez. So real parlay killer here. I'm sure a lot of people had Godinez parlayed up, me included. Really just expected her to go to the wrestling a lot more aggressively. I felt like that was really the path to win here. But she decided to, to strike with Angela Hill over the course of 3 rounds. She did hit some takedowns, but wasn't able to get much control time and didn't really commit to them afterwards. Was content to just box with Hill and lose a close decision there. Pretty poor game planning, kind of unfortunate there, but it is what it is. Moving along, Bruno Silva, Gerald Meerschaert. So this was definitely one of the more surprising fights, I'd say. I did expect Silva to have a bit more success standing, but he just looked horrendous in there, and Meerschaert was eventually able to clip him and submit him. Congratulations to anyone who had the Meerschaert submission prop. I feel like at this point, that's just something you got to spam bet. I mean, you'd probably come out ahead with how many submissions Meerschaert's hitting over the course of his career. But moving along, Ariane Lipski, Priscilla Cachoeira, early knockout for Cachoeira. Lipski just didn't look great either, so I guess maybe the weight cut did affect her. The 2 back-to-back weight cuts, the weight miss and everything, so ended up, I guess, being a bit of a factor there. But moving along, Devin Clark, Azamat Mirzakhanov. So another L here, and my internet actually crapped out early in this fight, so I wasn't able to see what went down. It literally came back up like right as the fight was about to end. All I saw was Mirzakhanov landing that body shot and dropping Clark and swarming him. But from what I hear, Clark kind of dropped the ball there. Didn't look like he shot any takedowns either, so I'm not sure what the game plan was going against Mirzakhanov. Pretty heavy hitter, so I'm not going to say it was a great bet or anything. But, just really sucks to see your guy not perform the way he does or you'd expect him to perform, right? So it is what it is. We move on. Yasmin Jauregui versus Lucindo. Ended up being a much more exciting fight than I think a lot of people anticipated. Honestly, I expected Lucindo to grapple a little more, but it looked like she was landing some pretty heavy shots. I don't know if the decision's necessarily controversial, but I do feel that Jauregui was landing more effectively. I think she was landing more, but overall, I'd say she definitely looked like the cleaner striker in there. And overall, it ended up being a pretty fun back and forth fight. But speaking of Nate Landwehr, David Onama, another very fun fight. Landwehr obviously had to battle some adversity early, but like I was saying, Landwehr is an absolute dog in there. It looked like Onama might have blown his load a little bit, but I also think that the quick turnaround probably affected him also, especially when it comes to these dogfights, right? Unama still showed he was dangerous late in the fight. He was taking a lot of damage, but still was able to sit down on some big shots and still get the respect of Landwehr. But, overall, just an insane fight. And then lastly, we had the main event between Vera and Cruz. I did bet Cruz in this spot. Also took him a little bit by decision also. Cruz, he did look good early, right? I mean, the footwork, the movement, he was blitzing Vera. He was landing shots on him, but eventually he got caught with that head kick, and he did get dropped a couple of times, which I thought his durability would hold up a little bit more, but, not completely surprised. Cruz, he has been hurt a lot more recently, and that's at this stage in his career, at this age, you are going to be more prone to getting hurt, getting knocked out. And at the end of the day, this is a young man's game, and Vera, he is definitely one of the more durable guys in there. And credit to Vera, I've been, maybe not hating on this guy, but I definitely haven't been giving him his due credit. He is someone who is a solid fighter. He's dangerous for sure. That said, though, I don't know if he can keep fighting like this against high-level guys. I know that the commentaries brought it up, but you can't continue to fight like this and expect to continuously get these knockdowns. It's kind of worked in his favor because he's fought some of these older guys in Cruz, in Edgar, and some of these other guys in Font, right? These guys are actually on the older end of the scale, right? These guys are like 35, 37, I think like 40 years old. So I don't know if this is a strategy you could continue to have success with against these younger, more durable fighters. And I thought Cruz would have maybe a little more left in the tank to survive these exchanges, but apparently not, and ended up eating that head kick. Probably broke his nose too. But rough end for Cruz there. Not really sure where he goes from here. Probably retirement. He's got a pretty nice desk job and everything. Would hate to see him take more damage. But yeah, that'll do it for the breakdowns and the podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Best of luck with your bets, and I'll catch you next week.